Good evening. Today is August 26th. It's 7 p.m. Central Time, and I'm coming to you from Austin, Texas. My name is Donna Imam, and I'm running for U.S. Congress in Austin here. And every 7 p.m. on Thursday, 7 p.m. Central Time on Thursday, I go over the week's most pertinent topics and present some of the different views on how people in this country, and of course we here in Texas, are seeing these challenges and pieces of news that we face. Now, we also open this up to anybody who wants to participate in a Twitter conversation on Twitter Spaces, 9 p.m. Central Time every Monday. So if you want to have an open conversation where you can join the conversation, ask questions, share your views with me, every 9 p.m. on Twitter Spaces. If you have Twitter, you can follow me at Donna Imam TX and join at 9 p.m. Central Time on Mondays. So let's get started today. Unfortunately, we start the day today with what happened in Afghanistan and what is going on there right now. We will go into what happened all week around the Democrats' power play in the House. House Democrats got into a little bit of a tussle there. And of course, we came away with the $3.5 trillion infrastructure bill framework and agreement of when that will pass, when that will be voted on, rather. We came out of the week with that all set to go. I do want to put a little bit of light on the police reform bill, which is also being right now discussed and negotiated among both the House and the Senate. This is something that got a little bit of light last week, but I would like to bring this up because I think this is an important topic that unfortunately is getting overshadowed by much more important things that are happening in the news today and in our world today. And of course, we will end with what is going on in Texas. We're in the middle of the second special session here of the Texas legislature, and today the debate over Senate Bill 1, the voter suppression bill that Texas GOP legislators have presented, was debated on the floor. So I'll go over some of the highlights on that and what could happen and what we could expect. Of course, we start the day today with very unfortunate news. And before I make any commentary on Afghanistan, let's listen to what the Pentagon had to say.
John, thanks. It's a hard day today. As you know, 2 suicide bombers assessed to have been ISIS fighters detonated in the vicinity of the Abbey Gate at Hamad Karzai International Airport and in the vicinity of the Barron Hotel, which is immediately adjacent. The attack on the Abbey Gate was followed by a number of ISIS gunmen who opened fire on civilians and military forces. At this time, we know that 12 U.S. service members have been killed in the attack, and 15 more service members have been injured. A number of Afghan civilians were also killed and injured in the attack. We are treating some of them aboard HKIA. Many other Afghan civilians have been taken out to hospitals in town. We're still working to calculate the total losses. We just don't know what that is right now. Their loss weighs heavily on us all, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through my prepared remarks.
So there you have it. That was the beginning of the brief that the Pentagon press briefing that happened earlier today. It was followed by a appearance from President Biden, who addressed this extremely tragic event that happened for too many American families. So last count that I saw, somewhere around 60 Afghans had died and 15 United States soldiers had died. Today, I cannot imagine what the families of the soldiers that were killed today must be feeling, must be going through. It's an unimaginable type of pain to know that they were there to evacuate other Americans from Afghanistan and evacuate Afghans who had been working with Americans for the last 20 years, 2 entire decades. What's concerning about this is the one question that is on everybody's mind is could this have been done in a much more organized fashion? Could this have been done without the loss of precious life? Remember, we only had 2,500 troops there earlier on this year, and now we have over 7,000 troops in Afghanistan in order to facilitate this evacuation. And this is where there are so many aspects at play here, because yes, the Taliban has taken over the country. They do have power, but do they have full control? We know for a fact that the Taliban is not a cohesive group, that they have many, many fractions throughout the group. And unfortunately, we also know that one of those fractions of ISIS, not Taliban, who have been fighting the Taliban, took responsibility for today's bombing at the Kabul airport that resulted in so many deaths. As tragic as it is, we went into Afghanistan, and most Americans, if you ask them today, was this a good idea? The majority, overwhelming majority, regardless of party, agree that this was not a good idea for American citizens' productivity to be used in Afghanistan. What's more concerning is some of the reports that are coming out that U.S. officials, and this has been corroborated by the current administration, that they did provide the Taliban with names of American and Afghan allies to evacuate. And although this on the surface seems like a good idea, here are the list of people that you need to allow to come to the airport so that we can evacuate them. This could also divulge names of people that could be, in some way persecuted, killed, hunted down, either by ISIS or by the Taliban. It is very clear that right now the Taliban does want recognition. They want recognition from the rest of the world. They want this cooperation with the rest of the world, because in order to get Afghanistan back on its feet into a country that they can govern, they will need financial support from many other countries outside of Afghanistan. So it's in their best interest to do this evacuation in a safe manner. However, there are absolutely no guarantees of what could happen. And this brings to light all the things that could go wrong. And even though over 100,000 American citizens and Afghan people from Afghanistan have been evacuated in the last several weeks since the exit started and since the Taliban have taken over Afghanistan, we still have so many people trapped there. And today, unfortunately, too many people lost their lives. And the real question is, how do we go forward from there? Do we as a country continue to take on these types of challenges overseas, where we have we go into war zones, fight wars in other countries? Do we continue to do this, or do we come out of this thinking that enriching the military industrial complex of our country? And there was also a piece of news out over the past 24 hours that there are contractors, private military contractors, that were also benefiting of these evacuation. And one of those were the brother of Betsy DeVos, who was providing flights out of Kabul for $6,500 apparently. I don't know how accurate these are, but it remains to be seen whether we continue to bend to the will of military contractors and these organizations and corporations that invest in war, or do we use the productivity of Americans in a much more fruitful manner? Those are the questions at play today as we move on to what's happening in domestic matters in the United States. Now, this week, there was a lot going on among House Democrats. So first of all, there were 9 House moderates and a 10th moderate joined them. They wrote a letter to Speaker Pelosi asking her to pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill on its own. And their argument or their reasoning for that is they are in swing districts and they need to be able to take something to their constituents to show that they have delivered something in order to win in 2022. So approximately 4 or 5 of those, maybe 4 of those 10 are actually in strong blue leaning districts. So that's number one. Number two is The argument that the progressives in the House have made over and over again is that if we pass the bipartisan bill, there's no guarantees that we can get you to support the $3.5 trillion bill that has now been deemed and passed, and the framework, the budget framework, has been approved by the House, and it passed on party line vote. But the concern is that once you sign that 1.2 trillion infrastructure bill, can we bring the House together and Democrats in Congress together to pass the 3.5 trillion bill? So that has been the power play that has been going on in the House of Representatives. Now, these 10 moderate Democrats are headed by Representative Josh Gothelmeyer, and that's how this week began. Now, this week also had a curveball thrown in here where Senator Kristen Sinema, who is one of the leading advocates and was on the bipartisan infrastructure bill committee, made it very clear that she would not back this $3.5 trillion spending bill. And so there is some conversations out there that say that the Senate, Senator Sinema and Manchin, are collaborating or cooperating with the 10 moderates in the House to ensure that this $3.5 trillion bill is not as big as it is. It doesn't have all those things in there, and they don't fully support it. And they want to ensure that their infrastructure bill goes through, but they're not as bought into this $3.5 trillion bill. So you can see here, she's made it very clear that she does not back this $3.5 trillion bill. And on top of that, she's not up for negotiating about it. That's one of the things that she's expressed, that it's too expensive and they don't want to support. So now there was, at the beginning of the week, especially Monday evening, there was a lot of back and forth between the moderates and the progressives in the House about how do they come together and whether the standoff stays. Well, I had my Twitter spaces, and one of the things that we discussed and I expressed is that I believe that progressives have the upper hand here. And so sure enough, what the House Democrats have agreed to do is they've agreed to an infrastructure bill vote by September 27th. And this was touted all over the news and on Twitter as a win for the moderates. So the moderates, got this September 27th date. So Speaker Pelosi agreed that there would be a vote on the infrastructure bill by September 27th, but the rules vote, which said that both these bills, the $3.5 trillion bill and the $1.2 trillion bill, would be voted on together. That passed. The $3.5 trillion budgetary framework, where they break out that $3.5 trillion and give it to all the committees in the House and allocate how much of it needs to be reconciled. Remember, it's a reconciliation bill, so they have to find money to pay for all of the policy that they want to pass. All of that was approved, I believe, on Monday night, or Tuesday morning rather. And the concession was talked about, is that there's two concessions that were talked about. So for example, one of the headlines was House moderates provide even more leverage to Joe Manchin on reconciliation. And they talk about the two concessions that House Democrats made or Speaker Pelosi made. And here they go. And I'm going to debunk these concessions right after I read them to you. So the first concession was this, that the House will vote on the Senate-passed bipartisan infrastructure bill by September 27th. So that was a concession because they said, look, we can't wait for 2-3 months for this $3.5 trillion bill to come together, to come to fruition, for us all to agree. We need this $1.2 trillion bill to pass now. We need to take a win, and we need to take it to our constituents. So that was concession number one. Concession number 2 was that the House will work only with a reconciliation bill that can get united Democratic approval in the Senate. So 51 votes in the Senate, which would mean all 50 Democratic senators would have to vote for it, and then Vice President Kamala Harris would have to cast the 51st vote in order to get the reconciliation bill passed. So what they're saying here is that the concession is that this $3.5 trillion bill, whose original architect is Senator Bernie Sanders in the Senate, is too big. That's the implication, and that the House Democrats should pass something that actually can pass in the Senate. So that's the implication, the 2 concessions that were made. So let's debunk these concessions, because as I've been saying for several weeks now, that House progressives really have the leverage here. The CPC, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, has the leverage today in the House. And if they continue to hold the line and use their leverage, we can get this $3.5 trillion bill passed. At least that's my opinion. So first of all, this September 27th infrastructure vote is a non-binding pledge. So yes, the House did make that pledge, the Speaker did make that pledge that they will hold a vote on September 27th, but this is just literally a suggestion. No one is going to be held to the September 27th date. So is it really a concession? You decide. That's concession number 1. Now let's look at concession number 2. Remember, concession number 2 was that the House will only work with the reconciliation bill that can get the votes. Meaning, the implication here again is we want this bill to be tapered down to something much less than $3.5 trillion. And I'll get into why that is not the right way for Democrats to go. But first, let's look at the bipartisan infrastructure group. If you look at the bipartisan infrastructure group, you will notice that 2 of the most prominent Democrats that have clearly expressed being against the filibuster, removing the filibuster, number 1, being against the $3.5 trillion bill. Remember, I just showed you that Kristen Sinema is against the $3.5 trillion bill and she will not negotiate. She and Joe Manchin are 2 of the key people in this bipartisan infrastructure group. And they're not just 2 of many. And here's where I really debunk this. This is such an important bill for these Democrats. If you look at this photograph, which was taken with President Biden earlier this year, you will see on one side you have Senator Kristen Sinema and Senator Joe Manchin, and on the other side you see 4 Republicans, and I think in the back there there's Senator John Tester. But the 2 prominent Democrats that are in this picture, photographed with Biden, supporting President Biden's agenda and the Democratic agenda with majority in the House, however tiny, and holding the Senate, however tiny, by 1 vote, and having the presidency, there is a lot at stake in this bipartisan bill. Meaning, passing this $1.2 trillion bipartisan bill is extremely important, not just for President Biden, but for Senator Manchin and for Senator Kristen Sinema. And that is where the leverage comes for the House progressives. It is so important for them that they will want to pass this no matter what. It is important for progressives to ensure that they hold the line on the $3.5 trillion bill. And I absolutely applaud the idea of Senator Sanders going to Iowa and Indiana today and selling this $3.5 trillion bill. It is important for us to communicate what is in here. And this bill is not perfect. There are lots of things in there that will benefit major corporations in this country and not benefit working Americans. However, here is the reason why progressives must hold the line for this $3.5 trillion bill. The bipartisan bill focuses on roads, bridges, railway, airports, hard infrastructure that this country definitely needs. There is actually no disagreement among Republicans, Democrats, independents that our country needs a renewal in infrastructure very badly. But the $3.5 trillion bill is going to make a big difference to working families, families with children, to get the permanent child tax credits. Remember, families with children are now getting tax credits every month. And there's a difference between getting this tax credit at the end of the year when you file your taxes and actually getting, $250 to $300 per child every single month. That makes a huge difference for working families when you get that as a check in the mail that you can go out and spend regardless of how much money you make at the end of the year and regardless of how you reconcile your taxes. This $3.5 trillion bill, it makes those tax credits permanent. Number two, universal pre-K for 3 and 4-year-olds. That is a big deal for working moms who want to go back to work, want to have a career of their own. There's childcare in there. There's tuition-free community college. Now, granted, there is no student loan cancellation in this $3.5 trillion bill, which obviously I think should be a part of President Biden's agenda, but tuition-free community college is a big deal for working families. For those of you who have teenagers that are in high school that are trying to figure out what they're going to do once they graduate from high school, this is a big game changer for American families. And of course, paid family and medical leave. Many white-collar workers who work in high-tech companies and major corporations do get paid family leave and medical leave, but the bottom half, in fact, the folks that work hourly jobs, frontline jobs, a majority of those people do not get any kind of paid leave, any kind of medical leave whatsoever. And this really creates tremendous pressure on working families. And there's housing rental assistance in there. There's home ownership initiatives in there. There's budget there to address climate change and the problems that we are seeing because of climate change. And of course, there's expanded Medicare. That means dental, vision, hearing for many people, expanding Medicare and lowering the age of when you could be eligible for Medicare, which is also important for people wanting to retire, thinking of retiring, or even people who are wanting to early retire. And last but not the least, of course, there's citizenship for qualified immigrants, including DACA recipients. And for Texans, that is a big deal. We have a large number of younger people that are on DACA recipients and would like to see their lives not be lived in this 2-year. Every 2 year, they're renewing their DACA status, and they continue to live their life in limbo, not knowing what's ahead of them. So these are extremely important policy, agenda for the Democrats. But here's the reason why Democrats should hold the line. Every single one of these are important for every single working family in our country. It doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent. These things will impact working families in a positive way. And that is why progressives should hold the line, because at this point, if they don't hold the line, they are the ones that would lose out instead of the moderates or the more conservative Democrats, rather. It is important for them to hold the line, and if they do hold the line, I believe that we can get this agenda passed. And if you're watching this wherever you are, you should reach out to your representative and tell them that you support this $3.5 trillion bill and specifically support these items, the items that will impact you, your community, and our country. And so with that, I would like to talk about something that is not being talked about as much. It's being overshadowed in a big way because of all the other things that are going on in our country right now, Afghanistan being on the top of that list. And that is the police reform bill. There are actually multiple police reform bills right now in the House and the Senate being debated and negotiated in the House and the Senate. The two bills that come to mind are the Breathe Act, which was introduced by some of the more progressive members of the House, and of course the George Floyd Police Reform Act, I believe it's called, or something to that nature, which was introduced earlier this year, which is the one that's really being negotiated in Congress today. The key negotiators on this bill are Senator Tim Scott. He is a GOP member of the Senate. Senator Cory Booker, who is a Democratic senator that ran for president in the 2020 cycle, and Representative Karen Bass, who is in the House of Representatives. She's a Democrat in the House of Representatives. The point that I want to make here is about qualified immunity. So lawmakers have taken qualified immunity off the table, and this is the most concerning item. Now, the average American, if you just talk to 100 people that were walking by on the street or walking out of the grocery store, and you ask them what is the definition of qualified immunity, they probably wouldn't be able to answer that. But I want to get into why this is such an important topic for us to understand what qualified immunity is and why this is important that we do not take it out of a police reform bill. So PBS News did have a clip on this last week or earlier this week, and I think the professor here does a really good job of defining qualified immunity. So I'd like you to listen to this very quickly. It's a short clip.
With it, why is it important?
Qualified immunity protects law enforcement officers and other government officials, even when they have violated the Constitution, so long as there's not a prior court decision with virtually identical facts. That means that people who have had their rights violated, sometimes in egregious ways, by law enforcement, have no basis for relief for the harms that were caused to them. Qualified immunity also dramatically increases the costs and burdens to plaintiffs in bringing these cases. It focuses courts on whether there's a prior court decision that holds the law unconstitutional as opposed to what actually happened in the case. And there's a variety of ways in which qualified immunity makes it more difficult for law enforcement to understand what they are constitutionally allowed to do.
Lenny, how?
So there you go. You see her explaining what qualified immunity is. Qualified immunity basically puts the burden on the plaintiff, the person that is trying to get justice from impact from law enforcement officers or other government officials beyond that, for example, puts the burden on them to try to find a case that is identical to their case in the past to be able to prove that that their case is eligible for some sort of justice or action, or that there was some wrongdoing against them. Instead of looking at the details of their specific case, qualified immunity actually makes them go backwards and look for a case that's identical. And that burden of proof is what is the biggest barrier among people who are wronged by police officers and other government officials, that they're unable to take any action against those police officers that violate their oath, and they violate their code of conduct in a big way, and they can get away with it because unless you can find an identical case, you have no recourse. This is why it is so important to understand what qualified immunity is and why it is important for us to not take out of a police reform bill. Now, I wanted to bring up what happened in 2020. When we look at the protests in the wake of George Floyd's death across the United States, this is a map of, USA Today posted a map of how many protests across the United States happened in 2020. We were told over and over again, we saw those images of people in the middle of a pandemic in every single state of the United States. People protested. In fact, the Washington Post reported the George Floyd protests are the broadest in U.S. history. So this entire country took direct action. They got on the streets. They protested against this brutal murder of a black man who was unarmed. And we want to end this protest with no real actionable policy. That makes no sense. It is so important for us to realize that those protests were not just to put one police officer behind bars. There is systemic police officer challenges and issues that people are facing that that was what the protests were all about. And if we do not remove qualified immunity, if that is not part of a police reform bill, after the broadest protests in the history of the United States, if we don't use this learning, this outrage that Americans across this country in all 50 states have expressed, to have real policy changes, if Senators Booker's and Senator Tim Scott and Representative Karen Bass cannot come to an agreement to keep the removal of qualified immunity in this Police Reform Act, then what is the point of Americans protesting, coming out, if we don't have real policy changes that we can count on? It is important to keep every single person accountable to their job, to their code of conduct, and what their responsibilities are. And if we decide to scrap qualified immunity, I can tell you that we will not have accomplished what we set out to do in 2020. And this is an important topic that I want to bring to you, and I hope that you will bring awareness of qualified immunity to your friends, family, to your community, and those around you, because this is something that's not being talked about in a big way because of so many other things going on in our country. So with that, we come to our last topic, which is what is going on in Texas and voting rights. So to catch you all up, over the past 4 weeks, I've been talking about what's going on in Texas. We originally had our normal legislative session earlier in the year. That concluded on the last day with Democrats walking out, breaking quorum in order to block the voter suppression bills that were introduced in the regular session by the GOP members of Texas. Now, after that, Governor Abbott called a special session that went from early July to early August. And around 50 Democrats left the state. They went to Washington, D.C. to lobby Washington, D.C. to pass some of these voting rights act, including the John Lewis Act and H.R. 1, to ensure that we could fight some of these voter suppression bills that were coming down the line in Texas. Now, why is it important to even fight these at the federal level? Because we should be able to do this in Texas, right? So here's the deal. Texas GOP members, they have a trifecta in Texas. They have majority in the House, in the Texas State House, they have majority in the Texas State Senate, and of course, they have the governor's office. And the governor here has line item veto, meaning you can pass a bills with good things and things that you don't support, which is a compromise where Democrats and Republicans have come together, let's say, but the governor can choose to only keep the things in that bill that he believes serve the agenda of the GOP and not take into account the contributions of Democratic members of the legislature. So that's what we're up against, and that is why the only way to block a bill is to break quorum. Now, I can tell you that many Democrats across Texas have been quite upset that the Democratic legislature here in Texas have come back to form quorum because they do not want to see these bills being passed. So what happened this week? So quorum was actually gotten last Thursday when I did my stream last Thursday. However, today was the first day that Senate Bill 1 was debated in the House. Remember, it passed committee in the House, and prior to that, it passed the Senate because the GOP has a majority in the Senate, number one, and number two, quorum was never actually broken in the Senate by the Democrats. So it passed Senate. It's now in the House being debated, being reconciled rather, and there are 77 amendments to be debated. So even, for example, if we believe those hearings in Washington, D.C., where the GOP representatives in Washington, D.C., the U.S. congressmen, were telling Texas state legislators, hey, you need to go back to Texas and debate this. Well, they're back, they're debating it, and there are 77 amendments. Remember, all of these amendments, whether they are good or bad or are extremely negative in terms of voter suppression, in terms of taking away people's right to vote, they can be passed because Texas GOP has has the majority, They have the majority. They can pass anything. So you can debate it. You can bring it up over and over again, but it does not mean that you're going to actually have a say in what goes in this bill. And remember, the governor has line item veto. So Democrats really have no control over what can be passed in Texas. So right now they're debating these four things which have been highlighted, but I want to bring, after these four things, I want to talk about one more item before we close on this. And there's two things here. One is that they are arguing early voting and how long those hours can be. No 24-hour voting, which is what the GOP wants, no drive-through voting. And there's lots of arguments around this. And I've gone over the ridiculousness of these arguments. For example, when the GOP is asked, why won't you allow drive-through voting? You allow curbside voting for those who are disabled. Why wouldn't you allow drive-through voting, which 130,000 people in Travis County availed to be able to vote with no problems whatsoever? They were able to make it go very smoothly. And why would you not allow that? Their answer is there's no privacy in the car. And that's ridiculous, because if you get a mail-in ballot, which anyone 65 or older in Texas can get, and you are filling out that mail-in ballot in the privacy of your own home, on your kitchen table, anyone in your family can see how you're filling out that ballot. There is no such thing as full privacy among family. So if you have somebody in your car, the assumption is yes, they might be able to see how you're voting, and you're probably okay with that because you've come with them to vote together. And a worst case scenario, you can ask that person to step out of the car if you really want that privacy and you want to make sure that they don't see how you're voting. Now, I bring that up to show you the ridiculousness of this debate. This debate that they're having on the Texas state floor makes absolutely no sense. They're talking about things that have absolutely no impact to the integrity of voting, which is what the GOP claims that these bills do. So with that, one of the things that I did want to bring up before we end today is that in the original voter suppression bills, what the GOP wanted to do is they wanted to limit the number of voting stations, or the number of polling locations and the number of voting machines in those polling locations based on distributing them evenly across counties, not taking into account urban areas which have high population. So for example, you may be in a spot where there is a big community center, and it's in a high density area, let's say in Travis County or in Harris County. And everybody goes to that because it's very easy to get to. It's very easy to access, for example. It's off a major highway. It has bus service there, for example. It has public transportation to that location. So everybody goes there, and let's say there's 200, 300 machines in this one big location. Well, what that would have done, this is in the original legislative session, the regular session, it would have limited not only how many polling locations you can have in a specific area, but how many voting machines you could have inside each polling location. Now, can those be amended back into these bills? And the answer is absolutely. Anything can be amended. Anyone can bring any amendment to the floor. It can be debated, and it can be debated to death. But at the end of it all, the GOP has the upper arm here. They have all of the power in the Texas legislature to pass any bill. And this should concern all of us as this gets debated for the next couple of days. I'll be watching this very closely, what's going on. And I hope you'll join me on Monday as we go over what happens throughout this week. Again, a lot of Texas Democrats very upset that quorum is still not broken and that Democrats are participating, but this is what's going on in Texas today. So before I end, I wanted to tell you a little bit about next week and what we plan to do. We talk about 2022 in terms of policy and what can Democrats deliver to the American people. Will they be able to hold the House? Will they be able to increase their, Senate majority? Or will they lose what they have today, the 50-50 split that they have today? But we don't talk a lot about gerrymandering and what's about to happen. So earlier in August, the census released all of the census data from 2020. And as you know, Texas grew significantly. We are getting 2 new U.S. congressional districts here in Texas because of the population growth. And remember, I reported that 95% of the population growth in Texas, 95% is Latino voters, Black voters, and Asian voters, and majority of that 95% being Latino voters, right? That is where Texas is headed as we go forward. However, because in Texas, the GOP has a trifecta, they have a majority everywhere, they will be doing the redistricting. And Democrats should expect Texas to be gerrymandered to the absolute fullest, to not only protect every single GOP incumbent at the U.S. congressional level and at the state level, but you can bet the GOP will expand their majority wherever they can. And this strategy, not just in Texas, but in other states where they have GOP control and GOP trifectas, where the GOP will be controlling redistricting, you will see this over and over again. And there are more states today that have GOP full control over redistricting than Democrats. That will be one of the single biggest factors in determining if we are able to win the House or not. And this will impact our country for the next decade. If the GOP successfully gerrymanders not just Texas, but all of the states that they have control over to the fullest extent possible, giving their incumbents double-digit runway like they did at the beginning of this last decade in Texas, where GOP incumbents were winning by 20, 30 points. That's how strongly they had gerrymandered. There will be no option. There will be no option for Democrats to out-organize. When you have a district where 60% of the voters are strong Republican voters, vote Republican, it is extremely difficult to out-organize, to persuade, to show them that Democrats can deliver on the American agenda. And that is why it is very important for Democrats to pass policy that impacts the people who work for a living in our country, because when it comes to gerrymandering, Democrats are at a disadvantage, and it will be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for them to overcome what's coming. We'll go much closer into this, and I'm hoping to have the writer of this article from Jacobin Magazine, Walker Bragman, join me. So if you are on Twitter, we will have him on Monday night at 9 p.m. Central Time, Monday night, 9 p.m. Central Time, and we will have a in-depth discussion on gerrymandering both in Texas and also what's going on in California and New York, Colorado, for example, how Democrats have given up a lot of their control in those states. And if you don't have a Twitter account, download it, follow me at DonnaImamTX, and join in the conversation. I hope to see you there. And with that, thank you for joining my stream today. I really appreciate it, and I hope you'll share the stream. And if you enjoyed it, share the YouTube stream with your friends, family, your neighbors, and your political groups out there. And feel free to subscribe so you can watch the stream. And of course, the stream will be up there for you to check out the rest of the week. So feel free to share it, and have a wonderful evening. And let's hope for the best going forward this week. And I'll see you, and I'll speak to you again Monday night at 9 p.m. So have a wonderful evening.